Well, we're here at another podcast for the soon-to-be named Old Scotch Collegians podcast. We'll come to that right at the end because there is a little bit of an update there. But we're very pleased to say that tonight we've got the Van Hattems joining us. We've got Peter Van Hattem SC 1974 and Nick Van Hattem 2002. You came highly recommended, both of you, by Silbs and Aaron from our pilot episode. So it's good to continue the tradition on. And it's funny because we said at the start of this project we didn't want to have too many people from the same kind of area, and we've ended up with 4 lawyers to start with. So welcome back to Scotch. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this. We might just start off just by way of background to set the scene. Peter, what are you up to now? Where's life kind of taking you to this point?
Where's life taken me? Well, I left in 74, as you said, went to uni, studied law, and then went straight into the legal profession pretty well, and stayed there until 2006, at which point I retired, and I'm now enjoying retirement.
A very well-earned one, I would say.
Well, that's for others to judge, but I'm happy to be here.
No, well, we're glad to have you here too. And Nick as well, thanks. Not unknown to many people, but just to be able to highlight the fact that you are an old boy of the school is something quite special. What are you up to at the moment?
I'm a barrister at Francis Burt and getting involved in some other not-for-profits as well.
Fantastic. And I know we'll come back to that a little bit later too. There's some really interesting conversation around there. So as is kind of standard for us with this podcast, we like to start off by asking what your fondest memory of, or what your fondest memory of Scotch is. So again, Peter, we might kick off with you on that one because I think you have a very rich kind of vein of memory to draw on there.
Well, fondest memory is impossible to answer because there are so many. What I can say is I don't have bad memories of Scotch, and I'd like to think that's because I just had a wonderful time all the time. I suspect it's because I suppressed anything that was bad. But even, what you might regard as bad was good. But I started in 1968 in the junior school. 1968 was the year of the Meckering earthquake, and I still vividly remember sitting in class late morning and feeling the floor rumbling, and our very alert teacher immediately getting everybody outside the building as the Meckering earthquake unfolded. So 68 was an important year in Western Australia. 69 had a good memory as well. Man on the Moon.
Of course.
Now, we had a new library at that time, and it had a television set, and it was pretty groundbreaking stuff. But we also had a very, very keen music teacher who wanted her choirs to perform particularly well. And at a certain time on a certain day in 1969, choir practice was on. And a group of us decided that watching Man land on the moon would probably be a better thing to do. So we did. We enjoyed that. We saw Neil Armstrong come down the steps, utter the famous words. The music teacher, though, was absolutely incensed and insisted to the headmaster that we be disciplined severely for not going to music. He was a very wise man. He was our grade 7 teacher as well as being the headmaster, and he had to appease his teacher and he had to reward initiative. So he took us all into his study, took out the cane, administered the cane to each of us, and said, if any of you tell anybody how much that hurt, you'll be back for more. I can't remember that the cane actually touched any of us as it whizzed past. But I've now told you about it, so if I'm back for more, well...
So be it.
I love that because growing up I was in a household of, abiding the rules, and it was wonderful to hear that Dad had once wagged class, but he wagged to see the moon landing. So that's the threshold for when you break the rules, I think.
It's probably a fair one too.
I think so. Yeah.
To be honest. No.
Beyond that, I think my fondest memories are really the excellent teachers that we had, some more so than others, but some absolutely stood out. And, our Latin teacher was Alistair Courtney. He was a long-time master of Keyes House. He was the commander of the cadet unit. But he was a classical scholar, and he taught us Latin. And you can't teach anybody Latin without first teaching them English grammar. And I don't think I remember much of the Latin, but I do remember the English grammar, and it's stood me in very good stead ever since.
I was going to say, probably serve you quite well for what you've gone on to do since.
Yeah,
then.
well, when you're using words, you need to use them according to the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of other things you did as well in your time here. We've got some of them listed here. Obviously, you were the captain of school in 1974. You were the captain of debating. You were quite involved in the cadets as well at the time. It's almost as if there wasn't a pie that you didn't have your fingers in at some point.
Well, yes, and I think that's one of the fond memories of my time at Scotch, that there were so many opportunities, so many things you could do. Some of them you had to do, and others you could choose to do. So with the cadets, I think you had to do that up to a certain point, but you could choose to stay on, and a number of us did choose to stay on, and that was a very enjoyable experience. There were other things. I mean, this comes back to some of the great teachers. The science teachers would let us do stuff after school, experiments with photography, chemistry, and so forth. Wonderful things to do, for an inquiring mind, and wonderful that the teachers would stay behind to let us do it, keep the labs open so that we could use the equipment. It was really great. So if you were of a mind to seize the opportunities, there were plenty there to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably something that's, again, stood the test of time here. I know that was certainly a very strong theme that would come through often from people, that, there's so many opportunities that you get here, and it's, absolutely vital you make the most of them. And I suspect even in the time since some of us have passed through here, that those opportunities just continue to expand even more. So yeah, that's a very strong theme, I think, that is, interwoven into the Scotch fabric. Nick, what about yourself? You again, quite involved in a lot of activities in your time here. What's your fondest memory?
It all comes to English one way or another. I've got a particular memory, and it reminds me of some other things as well. And the particular memory was, I think my favourite class was English literature, and I remember a particular group of boys, and we were all pretty cocky, we were pretty sure of ourselves, and there'd been a test to sort of see how everyone's going in the lead up to some more serious exams, and we'd all walked out of the assignment feeling pretty good about ourselves. And our teacher was Miss Piddington, and she was at pains to say, boys, you're good, but you're not as good as you think you are. Like, now's the time to focus, pull your socks up, because you think you're great, but you're not that good. And just as she was giving that really important advice, another teacher, Trevor Holcup, came in, just sort of wandered in. He'd never interrupted a class before, but he sort of said, oh, hello, boys. Oh, it's this class. Oh, well done in that last test, boys. You were incredible. And I could just see that Miss Piddington was so upset about that. I love the memory. I loved that group. But there's also a bit of reflection to the memory, because we had some extraordinary teachers, but actually we were sometimes a bunch of little shits and entitled, and there were times when we were actually bullying some of these teachers. And I've spoken to, haven't had this conversation with Miss Pivinini, but with another teacher who's gone from Scotch to a girls' school and just said, I couldn't handle it, like these entitled boys. And it made me so sad, because one of my most fond memories was these robust discussions in class, but there's also this other element to it of we went too far sometimes. We were not contributing to a workplace that was fun for everyone to be part of. Now, I've said something a bit negative. Let me finish with the more positive side to that. I've got lifelong friends from that group, and one of them I caught up with recently, and he's having a great time. He's working down south now. He actually sent me a little note to share. He talked about the same class and how much he enjoyed it. And he said, I was a bit of a talker and was rightly sometimes relegated to the hallway for misdeeds, which was a great understatement. But he had a very good relationship again with Miss Pivinini, and he was really smart, and he had these great ideas and expressed them in these great ways. But sometimes he, went a little bit too far and had to cool off a bit. And he did it with good humour. He concludes by saying she did some damn fine teaching, and he also recalls, as do I, being in stitches in that class. We thought it was so funny so often. But what I didn't know about him was that he'd actually struggled a bit. So he had all these great ideas that he expressed, but he didn't express them with good handwriting. So the teacher had taken him aside and sort of said, you've got great ideas. I take the time to understand them. The TEE marker's not going to. If you can't improve your handwriting, you're going to have a problem. And actually got him in touch with some occupational therapists who did some assessments, established that he wasn't able to do the handwriting, so he was able to do his TEE using a computer. And that's the reason he got into uni, into his preferred course, and that's the reason he's now having the life that he can enjoy from having those studies. So we will talk a lot about the opportunities and the teachers, but this going above and beyond in quite extraordinary ways, which have these impactful effects on people on into the future and see them on that right path. There's no question I was the beneficiary of some of that, and it's exciting for me to hear some of these other stories that people don't shout from the rooftops. They just quietly do these great things. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to acknowledge the greatness, and thanks, Miss Pivenini.
Picking up on something that Nick said, he made reference to Trevor Holcup. And it reminds me that one of the strengths, I think, of Scotch was the continuity of teachers. Now, some people would say you reach your use-by date and you should move on, but people can be re-engineered and repackaged. And Trevor Holcup was my English teacher in middle school. He was fantastic, and I'm interested to hear that he was a part of Nick's English experience. My headmaster, I had 3 headmasters. So there's a small cohort who started with Maxwell Keys, and lived through the Prest years and then saw the Dickinson era commence. I was one of those. And when Nick started, Bill Dickinson was still in the saddle. Ian Lindsay, who took cadets but was also a music teacher and had many other roles, was also on the staff at that time. I'm sure there were others, but those 2 spring to mind. And the culture of a place, it's not just the students who come and go, but the teachers who carry that forward. And I was reminded of that from what Nick was saying.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? And for a school which prides itself on the traditions, having those long-lasting connections to previous generations or eras is something that's probably not unusual, I suspect, but quite rare in the context of Scotch and how that, binds the various threads as time goes by. Now, Nick, you spoke about your love for English. That's quite interesting because, again, like your dad, you were quite involved in debating in some of those other areas where that's a pretty core component. But you also did some stuff around writing and poetry, The Raven. You were involved in Prometheans. Give us a little bit of an insight into what that was kind of like.
Yeah, I loved all of that. I've reread recently, I wrote a poem called From Where I Sit in English Lit, which was trying to be one of these sort of Oscar Wilde-esque type things. And it was about that class. So it was, I was never a sports star, but I loved the writing and I loved being able to carve out space to just do the things I wanted to do. So yeah, I did the compulsory, they had, Fat Boys sport of squash. It was great, where you could just go and play a couple of games and, still do a bit of movement, which I now appreciate so much more than I did at the time. I hated it at the time.
Makes two.
Yeah, but no, I get it. You need to move. But if you wanted to focus more on literary stuff, creative stuff, you could do that. You didn't have to be in the first 8 to be a superstar. It helped, but you didn't have to. So you could choose your own path, which is definitely something I really appreciated. The other thing, just as you prompt Prometheans, I think some of my favourite memories of Scotch was doing stuff with girls, and I think I reflect on that as well. I think it's a bit weird. The culture that you get from single-sex schools, I think it's a bit weird. And I think reasonable minds can differ on that, and I think there's various studies done. But what I think is unarguable is that the more capacity you have to do some stuff together, the better. So Prometheans was great. I still engage in philosophical discussions. That's something I've kept going with this great group. But the best thing about Prometheans was you did it with, I think it was the MLC. And I love to see that now the boat shed's doing a partnership with St Hilda's. I just think the more of that can happen in the future, the better.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point too, because certainly in the last probably 10 or so years, it's very noticeable how that relationship, even with PLC, has really kind of evolved strongly to the point where there are so many shared classes across both campuses, and that integration is so much stronger. I was at the WA Debating League semi-final recently, and it was Scotch versus PLC. I'm glad to say we came out on top. But it was funny, one of the staff there from PLC was reflecting on the fact that, well, actually, I teach these boys too sometimes, so it feels as much as my team as it does, your team, as she was saying.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, really good to see. Debating, another great example of opportunities to get out there and not, develop a bit of empathy, embrace a bit more this idea of diverse perspectives on things. It's the more of that, the better.
And I suspect, again, one of those things that binds your common experiences too is that love for oration and, making the argument obviously quite central to what you've been able to do since, which we'll come back to momentarily. So, Peter, leading on from that discussion around memories and what really stands out to you as being your kind of favourite times, how would you say then that Scotch has shaped you in terms of, as an individual, but also from a career perspective as well?
There's an assumption in the question that Scotch shaped me, but I'll run with that assumption because
that's a fair point to make too.
I think inevitably it must have. It's an interesting concept. What shape am I now, in a broader sense? And I suppose, looking back on that, my friendship group in the final years of school were all dead set on careers in medicine, dentistry, engineering, and our subject choices were along those lines. You did maths 2, 3, physics and chemistry, and then you had to throw in some sort of humanities somewhere, so that was just tacked on. And I was part of that group. And I think it was halfway through fourth year that I began to reflect on that, and it was heavily into debating, and it was around about that time the careers officer, I think we called him, Mr. James, got a lawyer along and got all the debating boys and anybody else who was interested to listen to a talk by a lawyer, and I think that was the turning point for me. It hadn't occurred to me up until then to study law and become a lawyer or enter that profession. And, well, as I've said, I did go on to study law and become a lawyer, and to a large extent that had its origins in the middle of fourth year high school. I think the other thing that shaped me, in my final year, as you've said, I was captain of school, and every morning I'd meet with the headmaster, Bill Dickinson, up in his office in what's now Collegians House, and we'd have ranging discussions, anything from what was happening at the school through to what was happening in my life, and I value those discussions greatly. But he was a little dismissive, I think intentionally, of my Air Cadets career, because he had been, I think, a half colonel in the Army back at his school in Melbourne when he ran the Army Cadets. And he was saying that Army was, a more of an experience. And anyway, I took it on board, and when I started uni, I joined the Army Reserve. And I did 5 years as a reservist. And I think I learnt a huge amount, which inevitably has shaped me, and I suppose I can attribute the origins of that back to conversations with Bill Dickinson. But for those, I probably would not have joined the Army Reserve. I don't know.
Wow, and that's fascinating too, the parallels there from a law perspective, because when James Edelman was about to start his appointment on the Supreme Court here, he, I think, offered to come back to the school and spoke. And this would have been going on, 10 years ago now. And the Dickinson Centre was just packed with people coming to listen to this guy who just has a impeccable record. And as we know, he's gone on to do even arguably greater things since that. So it's funny the parallels and how those initiatives or those opportunities kind of have an impact, and that link between students of the day and old boys and other people who are part of the Scotch community who can come in and try and have that impact.
How many boys in that audience are now lawyers?
Yeah,
because
that's
of that
right.
Speech. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. It was phenomenal.
And I would just say, if ever you get an opportunity to hear Justice Edelman address a room, get in the room if you can. It's a great experience.
Yeah,
there was a time when he was working as a barrister in Perth, I'd catch the train in the morning to my chambers, and he'd catch the train into his, and we've had these conversations on the train. I got left behind every time.
Yeah.
I thought I was fairly sharp, but no.
Next level.
Yeah.
No, that's he's definitely on the wish list to speak to us here, but we appreciate naturally it's
He's got some other commitments.
Yeah, it's a big ask. So, but we'll see. So then, Nick, how would you say that Scotch has shaped you? And I say that, prefacing it with the conversation we kind of had before this about what that's led to in terms of, you know, your extracurricular activities in your career and how you see Scotch through that lens.
Yeah, I've thought about it under a few different headings. The most important heading, I think, is service. So I think there was this idea that part of being a Scotch boy is you serve, and that was instilled in some ways at school. But I think I had it, and I think also from my family. But that's part of the deal, and so there's some sort of smaller things which build into a big thing. So the smaller things include scheduling. Like, I think about how I live my life and I just cram stuff in. I learnt how to do that at Scotch. That's, from the earliest years, you had your maroon timetable diary. I now work as a lawyer. I work with people who are really experienced business people and also people who haven't done much by way of schooling. And all these things that I now take for granted are not everyone's life experience. So the concept of having a diary and cramming it full and doing your extracurriculars, every Scotch boy that I know does that. That's a form of privilege, to be trained to think of time in that way, and how can you maximise your time, and how can you do everything, how can you fit it all in. I think privilege is another word that I want to talk about in this segment, and there are so many forms of it. So another one is ability to work in a hierarchical structure. The law is incredibly hierarchical, and I was trained in this school to respect hierarchy. It's just a way of doing things. And I now am training the next generation of lawyers, and many of them are pushing back against this sort of hierarchy. And I think that's to be encouraged, and it should be challenged and thought about. But I can say, and I've reflected with some other people about this, if some people can just sort of deal with it and say that things take time. If you put the time in, you wait your turn, you can have the ability to do some different things. My career so far has been this up and down of impatience followed by patience. So I've pushed really hard, pushing against that hierarchy, but I see that I've got hierarchy privilege where I understand it a bit better because it's another part of the Scotch experience of you wait your turn, you respect these structures, you respect these traditions. They're all important. They're a good way of ensuring predictability, a good way of ensuring people understand what's happening. So I think I'm not a person that I think really leans into the badge of Old Scotch Collegian. I'm very grateful for the time, but although I don't really align with that brand very much, I certainly see how so much of what I do has been shaped by the experience.
That's a nice little segue, I think, into the next area I want to explore in terms of what you've done, establishing the Piddington project, as I believe it was initially called.
That's
and
right.
Obviously now the Piddington Society. You're obviously being heavily involved with the Law Society as well, and that kind of volunteer aspect of service, as you would put it. So is there any links or any lessons, I guess, building what you've just said from your time at Scotch, which motivated you to do those things and get involved through the legal fraternity in that way? Yeah,
there's a few different parts to it. Part of it is sort of, I think there's another part of the privilege is Scotch and other schools like Scotch do give you the feeling that you can do anything, that you're in this cohort of excellent people. There are not many barriers to your success. You deserve it. You're part of this group of clever, hardworking people. You can do it. So when I had some ideas, I never really had much doubt. I had a lot of confidence, and that's part of it. I had an understanding of how to do things. I had good relationships. All of that is part of it. And then the other part of it is some guilt. So I was able to see that I had a lot of advantages. Being the son of a silk is a huge advantage. And so I did see that I was getting opportunities that some people didn't get. There's an interesting conversation about merit and what does it mean. And for me, it's all about how hard are you looking, because I still consider myself to be, not an idiot. But I can tell, I know that there are some roles that I got because they're like, well, PVH is no dummy, so this guy's probably all right as well. So Piddington is trying to share some of that advantage to people that aren't otherwise connected to the legal profession. It's to bring them into that culture, to teach them a bit more about how these hierarchies work, how some of these old school cultural elements of legal practice, how they work. How do you answer the question, how do you do? You don't say, oh, pretty good, thanks. The answer to how do you do is how do you do. It's a silly thing, but if you want to play by the rules, you can, if someone takes the time to teach you about them. All those sorts of unspoken things are things that I got the benefit of at school, and so part of the Piddington story is trying to share some of those things with people that otherwise might not know those little tricks.
So how long now has that project been running for?
It's essentially the 10-year anniversary of Piddington. It started as a bit of fun, and pretty quickly turned into this pathway for law graduates to get experience in community legal centres. So that itself, we ran our first cohort in 2016, and I was sort of planning and getting it up between 2014 and 2015. But now it's up and running. It's this wonderful thing. It's sustainable. I'm now at the point of saying, right, what do we do next? It's not me. I've sort of given it all the ideas and energy that I could, and it's good to sort of reflect on how it's come about, because I remember conversations with Dad around what should it look like. And a really important one that we've built into the design is around space and time. So my original plan was, let's condense it as much as possible, let people get through it as quickly as they want to, because there's a real desire for that. And it was Dad who said, no, don't expect them to do 4 hours of PLT study after a full day's work. One, they'll be exhausted. Two, they're not going to actually engage with that material. So that was an important early conversation, which was spot on at a time when work-life balance was, I think, less, and resilience and mental health and the importance of going for a walk, going to the beach. And I think, I'm not sure if you've always thought like that, or if rather it was more like at the end of your career, you're reflecting back and thinking, time to yourself to think, to spend time with family and friends is important, and our profession's losing it. Do you remember the conversation?
Yeah, I do remember that, and I don't think that was entirely an old bloke looking back. I'd like to think that I managed to maintain a work-life balance pretty well throughout my career. My wife might have a different view about that. She certainly, wouldn't have been possible but for a huge amount of support there. But to me, it's always been important. We were very fortunate to have access to a holiday house down south. My partners in the law firm, who similarly had access, would take work with them. I never did. Wrong. I did once. I recognise it was a huge mistake, and I never did it again. And that's the thing. You leave one behind. So the office is for work, and home is for family. Which reminds me of another story, but perhaps later if we come to it. Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting kind of discussion there in the context of what we've seen over the last 15, 16 months with COVID-19, and how that's forced people to actually blur those lines a little bit between what is the workplace and what is home, and how do you go about managing those things. I don't know whether you have any comment on that, doing what you do, because clearly as a layman here, as someone who has no idea about the law, when you're having to deal with, meeting, pretty high profile clients potentially, but also appearing in front of court and doing some of those other documentary elements of the job? I mean, that must be quite a challenge, I would imagine.
Yes, and I just came back from a weekend down south, which was a Piddington conference, because Piddington does all these different things, and it was such a reminder of the importance of getting away. And I am a sucker for, I'll just check this email, and COVID hasn't helped, but I've sort of dismantled my home office, so I'd set myself up to be really comfortable to work from home, and now I've said, no, if you want to be ensconced in screens, go into the office. And if you want to deal with an email, that's all right. And I will go back to the office. I'll probably be back there tonight. But it helps me to keep that demarcation of I'm here, I want to go home, so let's just put the head down and get it done. And then home is home. Really important.
Yeah. And so how did you then manage to stay really strongly to that philosophy during your career, Peter, given that, naturally you've risen pretty high through the ranks, and so naturally I would imagine you probably have quite a significant workload?
There were times when I was on the road, and then it was just full-time work. I recall in particular an occasion when I got a phone call in the office saying, pack your bags, you're off to Canberra. The native title bill was being debated in the Senate. The opposition senators needed some assistance on the legal analysis and implications, and would I go over and brief them on it? So I packed a bag, went to Canberra, I thought overnight, and 2 weeks later I came home, and that's how long the debate took in the Senate. And there was somebody at home holding the fort. So when I say I got the work-life balance pretty right, I got it right for me. Not necessarily for everybody, but there were other times where you'd go into the office in the morning, you'd do what had to be done, and then you would come home. And I think part of that work ethic came from my time working as associate to Sir Ronald Wilson, not an old Scotch boy, but his 3 sons were. And when he was at the High Court, I was his associate for 18 months, and his work ethic was simply, there's a job to be done, and when you've finished, don't feel you have to hang around. But there's a job to be done, and when it's 5 o'clock, don't feel you have to go home. You stay until you've done the job. And that came very, very early in my career, and I think I've clung to that ever since. But I do feel, the crazy hours that young lawyers are expected to work now, I don't know why they just don't employ more lawyers and put them onto shorter hours, but it probably hits the profit too hard, and the partners don't want to do that. But I don't remember it ever being like that back in the 80s and 90s.
And again, what we've witnessed and experienced over the last little while probably puts that issue into spotlight a little bit more, doesn't it? Because you used to hear all these stories about grads being, churned out and staying ridiculous hours, including, well into the early morning, and the firms would be quite good in providing, food and dinner and breakfast and dry cleaning and whatever it was. But now we've kind of reached a point where you need to kind of be able to draw a line somewhere and think about how do you manage those things best. But it seems as if you're almost a bit ahead of your time in that regard, because...
Well, there are cultural differences. I do recall when the law firm that I was in linked up nationally with other firms and ultimately became just one big national firm, there was a team in the Sydney office who'd been working on a big project, and they'd put out a newsletter that went to all the clients, sort of crowing about the fact that they'd been working on this thing for 36 hours straight. And I was absolutely incensed, at the risk that you run when you've got people awake for 36 hours working on something. What sort of gibberish are they turning out? But B, how you can be crowing about this. This is not something that's good. This is appalling. This is something that you address rather than advertise. And I was in a minority.
Yeah, interesting. I get the sense there's a very strong social justice angle that you both take to some of these issues. Is it fair to say that that's kind of also influenced what you've done, Nick, with Piddington and even through your involvement again in the Law Society?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know where precisely it comes from, but I think it is this idea of speaking up for people that don't have capacity to do it, giving voice to those groups, and that in Western Australia there is so much work to do in that regard. There are a lot of good friends of mine have pursued international work in development, which is really exciting. At the same time, in our backyard, there's terrible things happening, and I think that generates some of that desire to be part of looking at it, with the tension that our system itself serves to entrench some of the problem. So it's a big challenge. I enjoy spending time thinking it through and finding small opportunities to do some good, while at the same time thinking about the bigger issues and not despairing. But I think the best answer I have in terms of, I'm now talking about the effects of intergenerational injustice to the First Nations communities, and that essentially one bit of advice I've been given is don't think it's going to happen in your lifetime. That it's taken many generations to get to where we are. It's not going to get fixed tomorrow, but there is work that can be done now which will pave the way for future work and for future individuals to have the ability to do some of the work that's going to be needed.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to reflect on what the school does now in that particular space, the way it has that outreach to various groups that might confront some of those challenges, and the ability for this community to be able to provide some kind of support or assistance and to really help those people. And I know certainly the scholarship programs that exist now, I mean, that's come along in leaps and bounds from where it was, probably 15, 20 or so years ago, I'd say, based on just the kind of upward trajectory in terms of people on those scholarships. But that's quite a strong note, I think, to kind of round out that kind of discussion, really quite deep in a lot of ways and quite...
If I could just add a comment before we round it out completely. Sure. And Nick's not a clone of me, and he's taken things and run with them and taken them a lot further. And when he talks about social justice and he talks about service, these are advanced concepts of a very simple concept, which I think, whether Scotch instilled it in me or it just came some other way, I don't know, but that's the notion of being a contributing member of society. And when you're in a position that you can be, you sort of have an obligation to be. And that's what I think we stressed with all of our kids. And I think Nick's picked that up and run with it in his own particular direction and taken it a lot further than simply the notion of being a contributing member of society.
But it is interesting. I think our family does tend towards the social justice. So brother Alex, we were trying to schedule so he could join us as well, but he's a forensic psychiatrist and often working with very disadvantaged people. And sister Sophie is currently working in a top-tier firm in London in their pro bono function. So, couldn't say where it comes from, but we all get a kick out of doing that kind of work. It's got to be said.
I'm so glad you touched upon that from a family perspective, because I think it is a really nice way to roll into that next point, which is about what does Scotch mean to you? And Peter, I'm interested to know how you see your time here as having, or how rather your family's involvement with Scotch, even post your time here, has kind of changed maybe or reinforced what Scotch means to you.
Well, yes, I was the first of the family to come here. In that, well, my mother obviously didn't, and my father grew up in the Netherlands, so Scotch wasn't an option there. And my uncle was a Halian, so coming to Scotch was a bit of a break with a very tiny tradition, if it was one at all. But yes, I have two sons. They both came to Scotch. I have three nephews. They all three came to Scotch as well. My long-suffering wife, who I've mentioned, who kept everything going while I was having fun in Canberra and other places. was on the Scotch Council for many years. Her background is architecture, and when the architect on the council had to stand aside because he was getting a job as an architect through the school and that conflict couldn't continue, the chairman looked around for another architect and decided that Anu would be ideal, and she served on council for many years, having previously been, I think, president of the Parents Association or Mothers Auxiliary or one of those parent groups back in the day. And her contributing to society continues as we speak. So yes, what does Scotch mean to me? I mean, I spent 7 very formative years here from age 10 to age 17, and it definitely leaves a mark. I have great memories of the time here. I think I'm most grateful for the education that I received, the opportunities that were made available, and which, some were encouraged and others you just rose up and grabbed. But yes, I don't have a continuing connection with the school, so my connection was as a student, as a parent, and as the spouse of a counsellor. But that's all now behind me, and I don't think there's a continuing connection or feeling of having an ongoing connection. Perhaps there'll be some grandchildren one day and things may change.
Do you think in retirement that opens up the opportunity to perhaps have that more engagement, should you choose to? It's
not something I'm looking for, Nick.
Fair enough. I'm sure you keep busy enough as it is.
Well, I am, but also I like to move on. And I do recall another conversation with Bill Dickinson. It was while I was still at uni, and we kept up a intermittent correspondence. If something happened, there'd be a letter. And I remember one letter to him apologising that I hadn't written for a while and I hadn't been to see him or the school for a while. And his response was to the effect he was more concerned about the students who, having left, kept hanging around rather than the ones who'd moved on. Likewise, when I decided to retire from the law, I made a clean break. So my practicing certificate, I let that lapse. I didn't renew it. A lot of people were very surprised at that. But I'm determined that having been a lawyer doesn't define me, and I'm just me, and I move on to the next thing, and I've left that behind. So Scotch is no different. I'm glad to see that it's here. When I drive past, I'm amazed at how it changes every time in a physical sense. I think it's a wonderful institution, but I don't need to feel a part of it going forward.
Fair enough. Well, we're very grateful, as I say, that you've agreed to come back and share your story and experience, because hopefully that's one way that you can reflect on that time, and the benefit to the audience is to hear what you made of your time and your connection with the school while you feel you had it. What about you, Nick? Firstly, obviously, what does it mean to you? But again, maybe your own reflections on having had a father go through, and obviously a brother, cousins, and so on as well.
Yeah, and mum on council for sure. There are a few things I wanted to reflect on from what Dad just said. Being on committees and all these sorts of things, that's part of what shaped me, part of the service. But I think I learned a lot from Mum and Dad from their respective roles on committees. And so I think I learned from Dad, know the standing orders and know the Constitution. And I think they learnt from Mum, know the people. And I think it would be fair to say that there's some of your respective strengths in your partnership with Mum. So I've loved reflecting on that. I'm still quite connected, I think. I get along to the career breakfasts, which I think are a great thing. And I like to fly the flag for social justice at those things when everyone else listens to all the opportunities in commercial law, which are also excellent. It's interesting listening to Dad talk about his intermittent correspondence with his headmaster, and I'm still in touch with mine, so Andrew Syme, and I'm seeing him this Tuesday for a philosophy club, because he actually tutored me in philosophy in university as well, and I do feel very lucky to have the ability from time to time to have that connection. And also I just think about one of my most active chat groups is, the Old Scotch Boys, and I should make a shout out to Ian McDougall, who's very sadly achieved his dream of becoming a commercial pilot and having a great career flying internationally. And then, COVID means that through no fault of his own, the dream that he's achieved is temporarily on hold. I'm very grateful to Ian because he put together this chat group so we talk about his wedding, and we're so sad we weren't able to be there in Hong Kong for it, but we were so happy to tune in on Zoom to see him. And we continue, there's always some messages every day, and there is this gentle support from these people that I schooled with, and we just understand each other in a way that with that depth of knowledge that I won't have with other people. So although I don't wear the badge of Old Scotch Collegian, it's still very present in my life.
For sure. And I think in what you've done, as you said before, it was actually to perhaps broaden the opportunities for those people. But I'm pretty confident there's a lot of Old Scotch Collegians who have benefited greatly from your involvement in the community through Piddington, through the Law Society and so on. We are heading towards the end here, but I want to talk about a couple of things. So obviously, what is the best piece of advice you could give to current Scotch students, but also your thoughts on the future, because as you've noted, you've retired, so you have the hindsight of being able to look back on your career and life so far and think about what that means. And we've kind of explored a little bit, in fairness. But also, Nick, I know we're very lucky to have you because you were actually due to head off to New York, and so obviously with this current situation, New York's loss is very much our gain. So I might start with you, Peter, on I guess your piece of advice, and then we'll go to Nick, and then we'll come back on that future piece.
Yes, I'm not sure that I'm in a position to give anybody advice about anything, but you gave me some notice of this, and I've thought long and hard about it, and I guess the best thing I can come up with for people who are currently students is that you've got no idea what the future will hold. It could go in any direction, and the best advice is to use the time now to prepare yourself for whatever happens. Obviously, in recent times, we've seen the COVID experience and whether there's light at the end of that tunnel or not, and that's a frightening thing for some. The whole situation with, internationally, and the tension between China and Australia, our principal export market, technological change. In my own lifetime, I've seen the reel-to-reel cassette come and go, the compact disc come and go. The DVD, I think, is, if it's not gone, it's certainly on the way out. Soon you won't be able to buy a manual car. They'll all be automatic. Things like that. There is change, and I think technological change, the rate of change will just increase exponentially. So I think it's important to learn not so much about particular things, but to learn how to learn. And to me, that was the key part of a legal education, was not learning particular bits of law, because laws change, but learning how it works and how to find out what it is and how to learn about it. The other great thing about a legal career was that I was a litigation lawyer, or disputes lawyer. Each dispute has its own particular context, and to understand the dispute and be able to resolve it, you need to understand the context, whether it's importation of goods, whether it's mining, petroleum. I'm just drawing on my own experience. It was important to become an expert in a very, very limited field in a very short period of time. And then when the case was over, forget about that and move on to the next thing. And I think if there were advice for the current students, it would be try to develop that skill. Try to learn how to learn, and in doing so, recognise your strengths and build on them, and recognise your weaknesses, and rather than avoiding them, try to overcome them. Now, putting that in practical terms, I don't know how you do that, but that would be my advice.
Well, the concept's important, isn't it? You need to be able to start from somewhere, I guess, and that's a very good starting point indeed. Nick, how about you?
Pretty similar, I'd say. Two parts. Part one, make the most of it. That's something my grandparents would always say to me. Make the most of it. There are so many opportunities, take them. because you get, you get out of it what you will take from it. If you want to do all the extras, you're going to benefit from it. Take all the opportunities. That's part one. Part two, appreciate them, understand them, be grateful and be reflective. So there's so much to the Scotch education, which is a privilege, which is a benefit, which is something that a lot of people don't get. And I didn't appreciate it in 2002 when I left, and I didn't really have much thought about the different ways people in Western Australia live their lives. So looking back, I wish I'd engaged in that sooner. That these opportunities are incredible. Take as many as you can and think about them.
Fantastic. And any comment on, I guess, the future for you in terms of what you have in store next?
More of this. What is Scotch? It's tradition, it's values, it's about community. I think that's another thing that shaped me, that I love the Western Australian community and all the Scotch boys in it, and indeed everyone in it. So I'm very connected to this community and really enjoy being part of it. I like setting up new projects. I'm better at setting up new projects than running the old ones. So looking forward to some new leadership teams in some of the things that I'm involved with. My immediate plans are to focus a bit more on the barrister career. That for the last 5 years, I've been very focused on the co-curricular, and I need to spend a bit to get to the next level of my legal career. It's this hierarchical thing again, perhaps. It's this practice. It's this the only way to get good at something is to do it. Apply yourself, focus on it. So that's the immediate plan.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us both. It's been an absolute privilege to hear you reflect on your journey and your time and just your perspective on so many other things outside of, these four walls in this school. It's been fantastic to hear that, and I'm sure we'll probably see you again at the 20-year reunion next year, if not Founders Day before, which should be worth noting. Founders Day dinner, Julie Bishop has been announced as the guest speaker this year, so Friday the 22nd of October that's happening. So if you're keen on that, check your emails if you're on the mailing list, or go to the Scotch website. I think the bookings have to be made by Friday the 8th of October. So definitely get on board that one. Fascinating adopted Western Australian, really interesting career journey herself, and massive contribution, obviously. And then finally, we did say at the start about the name, and we had a lot of great feedback from people who have been very generous to listen to the first episode that we put out a little while ago and make some great suggestions with the names. We're looking at Oscars as an acronym, and I don't know, as the two English experts, you might be able to give us a rating on what you think of that. But we just need a few tick-offs on that one just to make sure we're not infringing on the Academy Awards. But generally speaking, it's along the lines of Old Scotch Collegians and Rising Stars. So that's kind of the theme we're heading with there. So maybe you're both. I don't know.
I think it's a tragedy that you didn't go with Chatting with the Champs. I love Chatting with the Champs.
Chat with the Champs is very good.
But I think that's the unofficial title forever. I think sounds good to me. Yeah, I'll give you legal approval on that one. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Excellent.
No infringement. Done.
Excellent. So thanks to everyone who's listened, and stay tuned for a very special podcast we've got in the pipeline in the lead up to the next couple of weeks and the AFL Grand Final. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. It's been a pleasure.